Hello, friends of the Devil Therapist podcast. This is Philip coming at you a little bit differently than I normally would be. Coming at you from my parents' house. I'm just doing a little pretext of the video you're about to see. I sat down today with a friend of mine named Benton. Excuse me. And we discussed a little bit more of a potentially sensitive topic in the way of sex work and sex trafficking. So I just want to come on and just say, hey, just so you know, before you get into this, if you are in a place right now that you don't think you can be listening to a topic like this, maybe click off, do what you need to do for yourself, and come back if you do want to support later on and listen later. I'm also going to be putting some links and stuff to some help and support groups for people so that they can, I realize how crooked my glasses are when I look at myself, sorry. I'm going to be putting some links to some support groups and some charities and just some stuff if you or a loved one is affected by anything that they need a little bit of help for. I'll put some resources in the description of the YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, however you consume. With that out of the way, I also wanted to say that there's a few things that me and Benton also talk about within this podcast, that over the course of this podcast, my opinion changes, and you can see me changing over the hour and a half or 2 hours, however long this is. You can see my opinions and the way that I look at things over this video change, because Benton did a really good job in not making me feel bad about having a viewpoint and from a point where I didn't understand something that he did understand. So he helped me learn, and he taught me some things that made me see things in a little bit of a different light. So before you jump down my throat or attack me or go to the comments about some takes that I may have in this video, because they come up and I got mad at myself within the video and like internally while talking to Benton once he brought some of the things to my attention and gave me a different perspective. And that's what I love about doing something like this, is getting the ability to learn from people who know more than me about topics that I haven't researched, because these aren't my areas of expertise. That's why I like bringing other people on who have other areas of expertise that I can ask questions, I can make dumb remarks, and they can help me learn, teach me more, make me more worldly, and understand things deeper. So if you are ready to be like this idiot Philip, you're right. I probably said some really stupid, dumb, ignorant things throughout this video, and I acknowledge them, and I get to learn from them within a 2 hour span, and it's kind of cool, honestly. So I hope you learned something too, maybe today, as well as, I'll leave it there. Just, I hope you learned something, because I definitely did. That's all that I can really say. I hope you enjoy. Thanks.
What's up, Benton?
How's it going, man?
Pretty good. What are you drinking?
We got an old fashioned with us today. Bowl of bourbon here.
A little bourbon. All right, an old fashioned.
All right, my friends, let's make an old-fashioned. First off, we're going to start with about a teaspoon of brown sugar, followed by soaking that in your Angostura bitters, which we want to muddle to get all that mixed up together. This is what brings the sweetness into the drink and actually makes it not just a glass of straight bourbon. We're going to fill our, I still forget the name of this thing. No matter how long I bartend for, I will never remember the name. We're going to fill it with ice, and then we're going to go with 2 ounces of bullet bourbon. Any bourbon whiskey rye will do. Give that a nice cheeky stir until we see the frost starting to gather on the outside. We're going to double strain, because if you're not double straining, you're doing it wrong, as we've said before. We want a smooth drink around here. You are then going to grab an orange and get a peel and fuck it up like me and let it fall in the drink. Do it a second time, and you're going to express all of the oils onto the drink. You are going to squeeze that boy, rim the glass, drop it in, and there you have it. We have a bullet bourbon old-fashioned.
According to Google, the old-fashioned, the drink first started off by being served in the 1800s, but the name came about in the mid-1800s as a reaction to more complicated cocktails that were being popularized at the time.
I like it.
I guess it was the only cocktail until other cocktails, and that's why it's
Well, it's stuck around, right? So must be doing something right.
It did so. Yeah, it definitely did something right. So Benton, who are you? What do you do?
Yeah, my name is Benton Oliver. I'm a student at York University. I do research there as well, kind of around mega sporting events, sex work advocacy, and just sort of informal economies in general. So that takes up most of my time. I'm also a bartender too. That's how we know each other. We used to work together at a restaurant.
Yeah.
And yeah, I guess between bartending and school, that pretty much eats up a lot of my life.
Fair enough. How does a guy go from being a bartender to being an advocate and so deeply interested in the sex work and women's advocate world and all that fun stuff?
Yeah, I think anytime I kind of speak or do conferences, I always get this question: is how did you end up in sex work advocacy? And yeah, I'll be honest with you. When I first kind of got into it, it was sort of I just wanted to put myself into the research world, and sort of was cold emailing a bunch of people just to say, hey, I'm available if you have work. And my supervisor that I have right now kind of came to me with this project, and she'd been doing sex work advocacy around mega sporting events since 2014. So I kind of fell in line with what she was doing. And then as I started to, I think, get more and more into the work, I kind of started to see, I don't know, a little bit of parallels to my own life and my own labor, which maybe I'll get to in a sec, but also to proximity that I had to people in my own life who were involved in sex work, either actually doing the labor or more close to me working with people who sold sex. I had people in my life who were incarcerated for bouncing for sex workers. And then just
sorry to interrupt you. When you say bouncing for sex workers, what does that mean exactly?
Yeah, so like the same way we talk about bouncing in a restaurant, right? It's
right.
You're essentially just providing security. But the way legislatively it's set up in Canada is that sex work is often pushed underground because we have these super harsh restrictions on how you're able to sell sex. And while the act of selling sex is technically not illegal in Canada, we tell you exactly how you have to do it, which makes it impossible to do illegally.
Right.
Yeah, so that sort of pushes it into spaces that are not incredibly safe and don't make for good working, I guess, kind of environments. And often sex workers will procure somebody who is sort of there just to be like a security guard or a bouncer in any kind of establishment or anything where you're producing capital, just to be able to I don't know, like protect you and what you're doing. And yeah, I had somebody in my life who was incarcerated for doing exactly that, and sort of led to like a longer cycle of incarceration.
The bouncer was
yeah
right.
Yeah.
To bring it into layman's terms, a more official and well treating pimp, if you will.
Essentially, yeah. Like, and this is sort of something that we dive into too, is like this idea of pimp narratives, right? It's like, think about jobs that you've had and jobs that I've had. All of us everywhere have bosses, right? It's not it's not a unique sort of, I don't know, phenomenon to sex work, but because we talk about the sale of female bodies, and that is not to say that it is only females that do sex work, because that is not the reality, but these things aren't unique to sex work. Exploiting people's bodies for labor is not a phenomenon that's unique to sex work. That's
construction.
Yeah, you know what I mean? It's like, it kills me every single time when people are always like, you're okay with women getting exploited for sex? I'm like, everyone's body gets exploited in some way, shape, or form under capitalism. All of us. Doesn't matter who you are, right? So who are we to pass judgment for how people wish to use their body in their labor?
Yeah, like you ever been to Amsterdam?
Never. No.
I went this past April, and the red light district, I've heard about it, I knew about it, but it's a whole nother ball game when you actually see it for yourself. And I got really interested into it before I went. I did a lot of research on it, and those girls are so well protected. So the way that it works is the girls basically rent out the windows. If you make the most money, you can rent out the best windows that have the highest traffic, whatever. But the guys or women, whoever it is, that actually own the complex, essentially act as that adjudicator, for lack of a better way to say it, for those women. They protect them. They make sure everything's okay. There's buttons in the room that if they have to press, they're good to go. And the government knows about it. They support it, and they do it in a way that it gives these girls an option to go about it safely. And in a way that it's work at the end of the day, right? And for a lot of these girls, like from stories that they tell, they come from broken families. They come from war-ridden countries. They're refugees. A lot of them are Balkan and come from further East European countries and come over. And this is their option. So if that's what they're choosing to do, what gives up to the right to say that that's different than any other body for work?
No, certainly. Yeah, it's how we use our bodies. I will maybe just add like a little bit of context to sort of Amsterdam and like a lot of the Scandinavian countries and how they regulate sex. It's like, whether you want to call it Nordic model or the Swedish model or whatever word you want to use, it's basically like a legalization of sex work there. So essentially there are specific rules that govern how you can sell sex. That is truthfully not my favorite legal framework, and most community calls from sex work organizations and the women actually doing the work. And maybe I just preface as well, as when I say woman, I'm referencing cis and trans women, but they're calling for decriminalization, which a little bit different than the way that the Nordic model is set up, right?
Evil in Amsterdam, weed is decriminalized, but it's gray.
I know, like for a lot of people, you say like legalization or decriminalization, and they go, "What the fuck is the difference?" Right? But it is, I think, very important, because a lot of what we talk about around this is not only like the legal constructions, but as well like the social constructions around people who are using their bodies for sex and using their bodies for work in that way, right? Decriminalization, what it does is it opens sex work up to labor that we already understand and accept. Because just like we keep bringing up, there's so many different ways that all of us use our bodies for work, right? Whether you're working manufacturing, whether you're working as a firefighter, whether you're working in construction, you're using your body as a tool to produce capital. And decriminalization, it views sex work in a way that the work you're doing is work. That is the beauty in decriminalization.
More so than legalization?
Certainly, yeah. Because all of the things that we talk about around sex work and exploitation, around things like people talk about like pimps, right? This fear of the pimp that everybody has is basically just describing a really bad boss. And thankfully,
me and you have had our me and Benton have both been fired from the same place. So
but like this idea of a bad boss, thankfully we have labor regulations, right, to kind of protect us from that. And certainly do I believe that labor regulation should be expanded to give workers more comprehensive coverage and support? Absolutely. But sex work should exist with that framework. Like sex work doesn't need specific legislation to govern how you can sell it, right? And that's sort of what pushes it underground into these spaces, even within like these Nordic models.
So you keep using the model term of looking at things, and I think I understand what you mean. Is there a current cultural model that you do like a lot of how they run it?
Yeah, so New Zealand actually has a pretty good model.
Fucking New Zealand's great with everything. Honestly, top 10 place to live.
Yeah, no, and the weather's nice too, a little better than here, right?
Right.
So New Zealand is kind of like in sex work and like critical trafficking, which maybe I can go into a little later what that means, but they are probably like the best example of decriminalization. But I think when this is taken up by predominantly like white feminists and stuff like that, we forget that it's decriminalization as long as you're not a migrant. Right? So that's kind of the added part that I always try and think about, is how are borders influencing policy? How is your legal status, your immigration status going to implement or I guess kind of insert itself into how you're able to do your work? And maybe very controversially of me, but I personally do not believe in borders. I believe in open migration and status for all. But yeah, that's kind of always something to think about. But in regards to just straight up legal framework, New Zealand, I think, is certainly doing the best job out of anywhere in the world right now.
And like, what are they doing better specifically than most other places?
Yeah, so like I said, it is a full decriminalization, right?
Right.
So they catch a lot of heat from it from countries that heavily criminalize prostitution, most notably the U.S.
Right.
But yeah, it's sex workers enjoy the rights of every other worker in the New Zealand economy, right?
Right.
So when we talk about informal economies, what we're talking about is work that is unregulated, the sale of drugs, the sale of sex, the sale of guns. When we decriminalize sex work, it is now a formal economy. So you can access things like unemployment. You can access things like retirement funds because the work that you're doing is not governed around it. It's not viewed as separate. It really does sort of encompass the work that you do as work.
Right.
Yeah.
And like, so slightly different, but on the same brand of things, a country like Portugal has a very big drug problem.
Yeah.
So they decriminalize drugs so that their citizens can get help, and so that they can try and fight the drug problem. A lot of what they're thinking about doing with opioids, if I'm not mistaken, in BC right now, because of that whole problem. But a lot of the thought process behind that, quote unquote, is if you decriminalize something like drugs for the gain of the citizens who are already addicted, because people are already doing it, such as prostitution, it's going to happen either way. So you may as well decriminalize it and make it safer for the people that are going to do it either way.
Yeah.
Do you think that in turn promotes it? And if so, do you see an issue with that at all?
I wouldn't use the word promote. And I guess when I think about this question, because it obviously comes up a lot when you start talking about decriminalization, is that people are not going to stop doing it based on the law. Like, we're sitting here drinking alcohol right now. Let's remember that alcohol at one point was criminalized.
Right.
It didn't stop people from drinking it. We have laws that make it illegal to use drugs. We have laws that make it pretty well illegal to sell sex. Here in Canada and other parts of the world, it straight up is illegal to sell sex, and people still do it, right? So I think we can absorb that fact and come to the terms that it's gonna happen. So as policymakers, as policy analysts, as just general members of society who are trying to think about these things, we need to be asking ourselves what decision is going to cause the least amount of harm. And I think decriminalization is always the answer to that question.
Fair enough. Well spoken.
Yeah.
Transitioning a little bit, and just going into comparing genuine, at least at the moment, criminalized sex work to bodily exploitation and a little bit of a boundary. Working in the service industry, especially as men, we get to see a lot of fucking shit.
That's an understatement maybe, but yeah, lots of stories for sure.
And within that, like, especially in the companies that we work for, and just kind of the model of nightlife, like restaurants in the way of like that serve a lot of alcohol and have lounges and bars.
Yeah.
It is a very, very, very beautiful female dominated industry.
Certainly, yeah.
And obviously they're not, well, depends who you're talking about, but for the most part, generally speaking, they're not selling sex in the way of the act of sex. But also, if you're a guy and you know that you want to go get served by a pretty girl, you know exactly where to go do that. So if you're going and that's a byproduct and that just kind of happens because you don't really give a shit, but hey, here you go, whatever. But some guys will go to restaurants and continue to go to restaurants, continue to go to the same bars, purely based off of the relationships that they make with the women when they go there. Yeah. And that's why at the place that I work, men were not allowed to be servers or bartenders or anything for years on years on years. Yeah. And at the place that we both used to work at, if you weren't a girl, you did not work in the bar area unless you
Yeah.
were a bartender.
Yeah.
And is that like when you really like boil it down, is that any different than
Yeah, like I think I don't necessarily have like the narrative itself logically I don't have any problems with, or theoretically I don't have any problems with, because like essentially what you're describing and what these girls are accessing, I think, is erotic capital or bodily capital, right? Which there are certainly lots of feminists who have issues with this. I personally do not. I think we are all born with different sets of skills and abilities. And if you are drop dead gorgeous, the same way as if you were born crazy smart, crazy intelligent, use what you were given, I guess, to
your
do the
best
best you can
advantage?
with. Yeah. And I think about, I guess when I kind of approach this, like when I talk about erotic capital or bodily capital, there's a really good sociologist and feminist, Catherine Hakim, who talks about how this is not exclusive to women. Men can also access bodily capital.
Well, I was gonna say, like,
Yeah.
you and I are not shy
Yeah.
of a little bit of an older woman sits
Yeah,
down at the bar.
exactly.
We know what we're doing.
Exactly. And I think in restaurants, when we're talking about, like, obviously, whether you're talking about where we worked or other restaurants or super popular chains that pretty much exclude men from like lounge areas, what I'm going to say is going to sound a little bit in tension with the ideas that I'm presenting, but it is misogynist to exclude men from those areas.
It is, but as a guy who at one point was running a restaurant,
Yeah.
from a business perspective, I would do it too.
But I would ask you though, is like, think about how many times I personally worked in that lounge and had tables of all women.
Well,
You know
okay,
what I
so
mean?
I always stress that this was my personal model.
Yeah.
It was girls running the floor, only guys on bar.
Yeah.
That was my model.
Yeah.
It was
but-
contain the men to one place,
Mhm.
because a lot of times, if women see a handsome guy, a few handsome guys behind the bar
Yeah.
working, which is oftentimes a female fantasy, like seeing a man do the work or whatever.
Mm.
So they'll be inclined to sit at the bar, let the women run the floor for whoever deems to come in.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, from what I've seen throughout the industry, men that come for women stay for guys.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is, like, I know so many regulars from my old job that would come in to chat and talk about sports, news, weather, whatever it was, with the male bartenders,
Yeah.
but would buy the girls that are running around stuff and be like, "How are you today, sweetie?" They
Yeah.
just like seeing them run around, but they like talking to the men more.
Mm-hmm.
So from that perspective, which also contradicts what I just said in the way
Yeah.
of I wouldn't let men in the lounge, quote unquote.
Yeah.
But if I had to pick one, I'm picking the women, because
Yeah.
also oftentimes, as from a business perspective, more men come in with money,
Yeah.
which is another full conversation with our economy.
Yeah.
But also, even if a woman with money comes in, women still tend to, in my experience, even if they're flirting with me, having a fantastic time with me, they won't tip me or give me more money than they were going to originally.
That's fair. And I think a large part of that is because, like, this is kind of how we socially construct things, right? Like, women don't front on you the same way that men front on women. No girl is going to give me $100 tip and it's going to be like, look at me, I'm going to take care of you, right?
Yeah.
It's like, that is not as common, right? But the reason why earlier I used the word misogynist to talk about the way that we kind of segregate this idea of who can do the work is because we ignore the reality that women want to kind of enjoy that little bit of promiscuity that men are afforded to go into a bar and flirt with a bartender, right? So I don't necessarily see problems with that, right? And certainly there are lots of people who would disagree with me, but a large part of this, I feel, is a product of this moral panic around promiscuous women, because the sexuality of women for so long has been designed for the nuclear family, the idea of ownership by a husband.
Yeah.
And when women access agency and individuality over their sexuality, much like a lot of the girls in the restaurant industries do, and they access that to accumulate capital through their labor. It's frowned upon societally.
Yeah.
So that's kind of why I see it in that way, and that's why largely still men are excluded from these areas, because women are not thought about in the demographics that have the ability or even the desire to access these services. Right. So that's kind of where I go with that, I think. But
So you're looking at more of as it's probably going to sound harsher than I want to coming out, but women get that. Like they get to have that.
yeah, like I think I want them to have that, right? Like,
I agree.
yeah.
They should. Sex is a woman's game, and what I mean by that is, like, men, generally speaking, aren't the seducers. There are men who know what they're doing and know how to flirt and how to be seductive, but it's the women, generally speaking, that are able to bat their eyes and use their sexuality as a tool in their lives more so. And if you disagree with me, please tell me. What are you thinking?
Like, I think, I don't know, like when we talk about this power imbalance in sexual relationships, right? Like the dominant narrative around sex work abolition, or just removing sex work entirely from being a thing, is the reality that, like, penetration is exploitation and a manifestation of male dominance, right? And I kind of counteract that to say is we deny agency to the people who are choosing to use their bodies to have sex. Women have the ability to equally participate in sex. I would actually maybe disagree, is to say that the dominant narrative around sex is that men dominate. Even if that is not the reality, socially, I think that is maybe like a more common segue, which is why we see these things where it's women are not supposed to have high body counts, but men are celebrated for it, because it's look how many girls you slept with, right?
Yeah, because it's the whole, like, the woman is the one who's quote unquote choosing to have sex or not. So if a guy can have sex with a lot of women, it means a lot of women have said yes. Versus if a woman has had sex with a lot of men, it would suggest that she says yes easily.
And it's that narrative, even this idea of saying yes or agreeing, it's presented in such a submissive tone that kind of conveys the ways in which sex manifests male dominance, which I don't believe to be the case. I believe women have the agency to want to have sex. It's not that you said yes or you let somebody have sex with you. You wanted to fuck whoever you fucked, and that's fine, right? There's no issue with that. But we have this panic around it because it comes into contrast with the ideas that we have around femininity and the way that women are supposed to act. And that is kind of where I take a bit of an issue with this idea of, I don't know, like submissive tones around how women participate in sex.
If anything, I would say that it's the person who's making the choice to do something or not that holds the power, that holds the dominance.
Yeah, certainly.
So, like, I've been there, and I know a lot of guys that have been there that have been like begging for a fucking crumb of pussy. And it's like that's some of the most submissive little bitch shit that I've ever seen in my life. That's not quote unquote this dominant masculinity.
Absolutely.
Women, and that's what I mean. That's what I went back to what I was saying earlier. When it comes to sex, I believe that women hold the power dynamic in sexual relationships.
Yeah, I would agree with you maybe to some extent. I like to think of it more as that, like, even in my own personal experience, when I've had sex with people, I've made that decision, right? I don't like to think of it as an imbalance in power, but mutual power. We're both consenting to having sex, right? And I think that's kind of the way that the discourse should see itself travel, is that nobody is being exploited. It is merely an act of service, an act of pleasure between two people who are consenting to do something, right? And that's kind of the way I like to think about it, and the way I like to talk about sex, because I think it removes these notions of power around sex, right? And certainly there are situations and, unique circumstances where maybe that discussion should take a little bit of a different term.
Mm.
But generally speaking, around consensual sex, I think that's the way we should be talking about it.
Yeah, I like that. Like, as a society, we put so much emphasis on the differences between the gender, on gender roles, on whose job it is to do what, and who holds power in the patriarchy and who holds power in daily life and sex and whatever. But when we're what you just said makes perfect sense. If two people both want to have sex with the other person, then neither of them hold the power. They're just having sex.
Certainly, yeah.
Right. And then you could even transition that into, okay, well, if there has to be a dominant male, or if the female holds the dominance for that matter, what happens in non-cisgender relationships?
Yeah.
Does someone still have to hold it? Or again, is it just two people who want to have sex?
Yeah, but I think even if we talk into homosexual relationships, I think we have this obsession with establishing those gender roles.
Like, oh, who's the guy in the relationship?
Yeah, like who's the top,
pants?
who's the bottom? Like, we love assigning power, because this idea of people in a relationship being treated as equals, where one does not hold power, there's not, I guess, a preset of responsibilities. It's uncomfortable for a lot of people. And I think that is why we search so often in homosexual relationships, to kind of reestablish that as like a sense of comfort, right? So
from everything you've studied and from where you've been, why do you think humans have such a hard time accepting that, and just accepting that two people can both pull on a cord at the same time and it snaps in the middle and one person doesn't get pulled over?
Like, why do I think the gender power exists? Is
why do you think it exists, and why do you think people have such a hard time not be able to not look at relationships that way?
I think it's just been that way for a long time, and not exclusively to like things like gender or race or class. It's just people don't like change. Right? We're all kind of resistant to change. We get comfortable in the way that things are, and we think that's how they should be. And then when somebody offers an alternative that disrupts the way that we see and think about the world, we put our backs up a little bit. And a lot of that is, I guess, sort of like a comfort reflex. We're just trying to find a little bit of familiarity in a very quickly changing world, right? And I don't know. I think when you get into sociology or political science or basically any humanity, or there we go. Humanity.
You're on a great stretch.
Yeah. Humanity discipline, you get very comfortable with unknowing everything that you've ever learned, right? That's kind of the basis of what it is, so that you can objectively examine what is going on. Right, you try to strip all biases and notions that you might have had going into assessment to allow you to look at the problem more holistically, zoom it out a little bit. But for a lot of people, that's something that is new, right? And I can understand that, right? Like, having the time and the privilege to even sit down and talk about these things is a product of situations that I had, right? It would be totally ridiculous of me to expect people to sit down with like these big texts that take me, who is awarded time to work through them, like months to get through, on top of working a job for like 60, 70 hours a week. And I think we have to take that into consideration and say, we can demand social change now without passing moral judgment on those who are resistant to it.
You have made me feel like a monkey brain today. You've done a great yeah, fuck, that was... You keep so eloquently phrasing these things to give me such good points. And
Lots of practice.
I'm like, I don't even have like wow, well done, sir.
Yeah, try my best for it.
In my own relationships, I've always felt as a guy who doesn't necessarily fit into the textbook old look that way, however you want to phrase it, idea of like masculinity
Mm-hmm.
and what a man should be and
Yeah.
all these things. And for a long time, I really struggled with that. And I one day kind of thought to myself, why does that have to be what masculinity is? Why can't masculinity be what I deem it to be for me?
Yeah.
And I think more so than anything, for me, being masculine just means being comfortable in my own skin, being assertive, and holding my own ground and holding to my own truths and being okay to be who I am every day. But a lot of people, and even a close friend of mine, would say that no, a man should be dominant. He should be the one to do this, and he should be the caretaker. And they're very, very big on the nuclear family.
Yeah.
And women want to feel like women, and they want to feel protected and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Where do you rebuttal that, and where do you view that idea of like the true nuclear family and the people that have these strong attachments to gender roles, to kind of be like, no guys, what you can obviously, like you said, the whole change is hard thing, but how could you open someone's eyes who has a very firm stance on the matter?
And this is kind of what I was getting at before, maybe too, is that people become very resistant to these ideas, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think depending on the space I'm in, the tone and the language I'm going to use is going to change. But like, it's not a newsflash that gender is not a real thing, right? Sex certainly is. There's biological basis in sex, absolutely. But gender is something that we have constructed, we've hegemonically disseminated and kind of set it as a standard of things that have to be. And in that construction, right, there's a spectrum. Gender is a spectrum. It's not anything new. But you can exist anywhere on that spectrum. And when you were talking about what it means for you to be assertive, I think about all of these like leadership and I don't know, just this idea of men as leaders. And I'm always a little bit apprehensive when people start talking about that, because these qualities of leadership and standing up for yourself, I don't think belong in a gender designation, right? Like, okay, me personally, for example, a lot of people would meet me on the street, not know what I do, quick conversation about like interests and hobbies. I've played contact sports my whole life. I play basketball now. I ride chopper motorcycles. I'm into vintage cars. Like, these are very masculine things. On these, you would make assumptions about personal qualities and traits. I don't think those reflect, sure, I can be assertive, I can be dominant, but that's not because I do all of these other things that are associated with masculinity. They're totally unrelated. And in the spaces that I work in, some of the most dominant, some of the most assertive, some of the most well-spoken, and some of the best leaders I've ever met are not men, but women. And women who appear not to be these masculinized versions of femininity, but create their own space to practice things that feel right for them.
I know so many women, more so, I could count on one hand the amount of guys that I'll use scared or fear as like a way of looking at like an intimidation factor, I guess, from a place of being assertive. I know on one hand the amount of guys that scare me.
Yeah.
Fuck, dude. I know so many women that terrify the shit out of me.
Fair enough. Yeah.
And it's not because like, oh, I'm scared of pretty women, but like, I know way more women that are like solid in themselves and assertive in themselves and proud of themselves and just don't put up with shit.
Yeah.
And I don't look at them as masculine in the slightest. I just look at a lot of them are hyper feminine, but have a lot of self-worth.
Certainly.
And I feel like from everything that I'm getting at from you, the whole idea of the nuclear family and those traditional gender roles are trying to strip a little bit of self-worth from women to make them feel like they are reliant on a typically dominant man.
Yeah. I don't know. And it's like nuclear family kind of comes up for me like a lot, like the ideas and the roles of what it means to be a woman and where that responsibility lies historically, like domestically, like the labor you're supposed to produce as a wife or somebody's wife. Like what are you supposed to do, right? And I think my favorite interpretation of that is in The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir. The
references are fantastic.
She quotes somebody else, but that's where I accessed it. And that, to paraphrase, the prostitute and the wife, the only difference between them is the length of the contract and how much money they're paid. And I think that's so impactful because it starts to poke at things beyond sex. Also too in restaurants, even though we are not selling sex, girls in restaurants are not having sex with the customers, right? But they're providing something that women historically have been responsible for producing in the household. This notion of care work, that's what they're doing. We're going in somewhere, somebody is serving you and feeding you and cleaning up after you. These model traditional gender roles, which is also why I think there's resistance to men being at the height of these roles in the service industry, right? Because these are a woman's job. How dare a man try to come in and do this? That's not a men's job. These are for women, right? Taking on this, I don't know, understanding of gender equality means deconstructing these notions. And it's fine to do it. I don't have a problem with people doing it and accessing it. But when we start to compare and contrast what we're expected women to do in the household, or not the household, but the house, as opposed to the brothel, you're still providing care beyond sex. And I think in very traditional senses of marriage and the nuclear family, you are rewarded in marriage for your domestic labor via financial compensation for the work that you do.
Well, like I've heard stories on stories on stories of prostitutes, escorts, whatever, and that's another conversation entirely. Women who are paid just to spend time with a man without sex involved at all. That the sex, it happens at some point throughout the evening, but a lot of it is just the men having someone to talk to have the company of. If you think about like the traditional dad's wet dream, a restaurant's exactly that. The pretty girl walks over, gets you what you want, if only speaks when spoken to, really, cleans up after you, serves you and your friends, leaves, and just is at your beck and call, and then is compensated monetarily.
And you know what? If you want to pay somebody to do that, do it. If you're comfortable doing that work, you want to use your body in that way, do it. Nobody should have the right to tell you how you use your body, even if that means perpetuating these ideas. But I think that men, in particular myself too, in my experience in the service industry, like I have seen myself, I've done it, where I have been that for somebody else. I've provided this notion of domestic labor for a woman and been compensated for it generously. But what I'm trying to get at, I guess, is that this kind of tension and the idea that exists that, no, actually, I'm going to scrap that completely. But what I am going to say, maybe to kind of end off, because I see you continuously checking your phone here.
I saw the timer was like 1 minute, so I just turned it off. So
no worries.
But well done.
Is that when I earlier used the word misogyny, and the reason why men should uptake feminism is because unpacking a lot of the barriers that we have around gender and ideas and identity that everybody struggles with starts from the bottom. Power always works top down, and it's alleviated, or we find liberation from the bottom up. And when we talk about gender, we have to talk about women's rights. Trans and cis work from the bottom and then go our way up.
Well done. Well spoken. As usual, if I have a sponsor, now is the time that you'll hear from them. Otherwise, I'll just see you in a minute.
Sweet.
All right. Welcome back. All right. Well, as as humbling of an experience as that was. That was awesome. We could go on for that for God knows how much longer, but transitioning a little bit, your specific area of research is more so to do with sporting events and a look at sex work, correct?
Yeah. So it's more so around anti-trafficking initiatives around mega sporting events. Like that's kind of where we go. There's quite, I don't want to say comprehensive because there's not that many people doing it, but there's some very good literature that exists from Canadian scholars, from York specifically, actually, around anti-trafficking, the racism of anti-trafficking, the coloniality of anti-trafficking, and kind of how that manifests. And then my work, which is in line with my supervisor's work as well, is about how mega sporting events drive these narratives. They further them around this idea of trafficking. Because often when we talk about anti-prostitution laws, we see the discussion around these laws in tangent with anti-trafficking initiatives, right? There's a conflation between consensual sex work and trafficking that legislatively guides a lot of the decisions that governs the way you can sell sex, how you can sell sex, if you can even sell sex. So right now, the work I'm doing is in Los Angeles around the Figueroa Corridor in South LA. So in California, they're a full criminalization state. It's actually illegal to buy and sell sex.
Right.
So what we are looking at right now is there's a new city attorney who has taken office and has taken up this idea that human trafficking is something that needs to be alleviated along the South Figueroa Corridor in Los Angeles, which is probably the most popular place to buy and sell sex in Los Angeles. So as a result, LAPD, which actually has a specialized prostitution vice units where they carry out buy and bust. So they'll either pose as a sex worker and then you come in to try and buy sex, they're going to arrest you, or they pose as a buyer. So they'll come in and try and procure the services of somebody who's posted online or is working out of a motel. And where it gets super weedy is that these male undercover cops are going in and buying sexual services, receiving them, and then arresting workers along the Figueroa Corridor in Los Angeles.
So hold on. They're not like narking in the way of like, let me have those drugs.
Yeah.
Okay, here you go.
No.
Oh, you're under arrest.
Yeah.
It's top me off.
Yeah, pretty well.
Receives head and then arrest them.
Yeah, like imagine an undercover cop like buying crack, smoking it, and then arresting somebody. Yeah, and LAPD is not forward with this, but we work with community groups in Los Angeles with people who have been arrested, and they've shared pretty openly that, like, no, we're performing sexual services and then being arrested afterwards. Yeah,
that's fucking ridiculous.
It's crazy. Yeah.
And because there's no legislation around it,
well,
they can get away with it.
Yeah, like it's fully illegal to sell sex. So if you are selling sex in California, regardless of whether we feel it's morally right or wrong, you are eligible to go to jail, right?
But then you also said that they sometimes send in people posing as sex workers to catch people trying to purvey sex work, correct?
Yeah.
So in theory, if one LAPD officer goes undercover, buys sex work from a girl, allows her to perform it, and another LAPD officer saw it, he could arrest the one there for proclaiming it.
No, it's like, it's pretty isolated and it's pretty targeted, right? And I think they all work together and they all know when they're doing, and they've carried out this kind of like string of arrests that's been going on since November of last year through December into January now, where they're just doing these like prostitution stings, they call them. But so that's kind of where we're at right now. And previous work that I've done and published has looked at these global narratives of anti-trafficking being driven by the FIFA World Cup. So myself and my supervisor, we did a review of every World Cup from 2006 in Germany all the way up until 2022 in Qatar.
Mm-hmm.
And we kind of traced this narrative that continuously permeates World Cups and Olympics as well. But this piece was focused more so on World Cups, as to say that we have this global hype around human trafficking. And this isn't to say human trafficking doesn't place. It does. But when we criminalize sex work and we understand sex work as exploitation, we group consensual sex workers who are just using their bodies under capitalism and having their bodies exploited the same way as everybody else who is using their body as a tool as trafficked.
When you say trafficked, when you say sex trafficking, what exactly do you mean? Like, how do you define that?
So how I define it is in line with how a lot of these like humanitarian superpower organizations define it. If you ask the government of Canada in the Criminal Code of Canada, you have to cross a border to be trafficked. That's what trafficking is, right? Is crossing borders. That's at the basics of the word. But it's not really, or I shouldn't say it's not really, because factually that is what the definition is, but it's understood more so as the exploitation of human services, I think, is what people are going to dominantly understand human trafficking as. But if you think about like drug trafficking, this idea of borders, I think is a lot clearer for a lot of people, but not really how it's taken up. We talk about like human trafficking rings. They're like domestic workers, migrants as well, but a lot of the times they're domestic workers who are in this country, in this city, who are claiming are being trafficked, despite the fact that they're not crossing borders. Right. So yeah, that's kind of where I go with that.
And in the terms of the World Cup and the Olympics, these organizations are promoting essentially sex workers to cross borders to be involved?
No, quite the opposite, actually. So a lot of these organizations pretty well just straight up deny that sex workers work. So they are under the opinion that sex work is exploitive and kind of go from there, as to say, so all those things I just said are true, but I'm going to change directions a little bit to say that there's kind of this panic around that when mega sporting events come to a town, there's going to be this increase in demand for sexual services.
Okay.
Right? This kind of the reason why we started in 2006 Germany is that there was this Hungarian politician who kind of introduced this 40,000 number, that 40,000 women and children were going to be trafficked into Germany for the purpose of exploitation, of sexual exploitation. That didn't happen. We have governments from German police forces and the German government that say that simply wasn't a reality. But it was so powerful because societally and morally, there is this notion around female sexuality that it has to be something that's protected because we're saving it for this idea of marriage, right? So it's well taken up, and it's such a attractive and sexy issue, because who is going to agree with trafficking women and children for the purpose of sexual exploitation?
Especially once you add children into that. As soon as you say the women and children, everyone's brain immediately goes to like a protect sector.
Yeah, obviously, right? And it's such an attractive issue for so many companies with money to get behind, because nobody's going to disagree with it. It's not controversial. We're not talking about racial equity or gender rights, right? Like, it's not like Bud Light, who just saw a bunch of controversy because they started to hop on like LGBTQ plus advocacy. No one's going to disagree with it. Human trafficking is bad, obviously. I think human trafficking is bad. However, we need to separate human trafficking from consensual sex work. So like a lot of the times we push these narratives, and that's what happened in the case of the World Cup, is that we saw these things get recycled over and over and over and over again, this number of 40,000. And following Germany, there was some really fantastic researchers in South Africa, which I feel is actually the strongest part of that piece that I published. No increase in the demand or sale of paid sex. And we often like to paint this idea of the sex worker as diseased, right? Because now it's not only an anti-trafficking initiative, it's a public health initiative.
Right.
We're limiting the spread of AIDS and HIV. No reported increase in the spread of HIV or AIDS as well when South Africa hosted the World Cup in 2010. However, as soon as that happened again in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, we saw the same thing happen again, anti-trafficking initiatives. That's kind of where my supervisor's work is based, is Rio de Janeiro. Yeah.
Trying to make sure that I'm on the same page.
Yeah.
These organizations and governments are trying to make it seem as if though the occurrence of these events is driving sex trafficking.
Yeah, absolutely.
When there is no concrete evidence in any way, shape, or form
Certainly
that
not.
would suggest that.
Yeah.
And they're not doing it to boycott the events. They're doing it as a form to boycott sex work.
Yeah, it's kind of like it's like humanitarian intervention, right? So a lot of these organizations that take up this issue of human trafficking, we forget that humanitarian intervention is a very profitable market. So now you have a really sexy issue that no one's going to disagree with. Nobody wants people to be trafficked and forced to have sex, right? And you're able to make money off of it. It's going to become quite profitable.
Yeah.
And you look at these organizations and the data that they cite, and I'll use It's a Penalty, for example, because they're super popular anti-trafficking organization around mega sporting events. For Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, their source for this concern around women and children being trafficked in for the purpose of sexual exploitation was a group of Brazilian nuns. That's who they're citing, right? So you don't have to be a genius to kind of see the the
shortcomings
of the tensions of that source, maybe, or invested interest.
My thesis supervisor would not have let me
certainly
cite
not.
that.
No. So oh my gosh. But yeah, that's kind of where I try and go with it, is that we don't have empirical data to support these claims. And in the contrary, we have data that says actually quite the opposite is happening. In cases like South Africa, we saw a decline in the desire for people to purchase and procure sexual services
while the World Cup was occurring.
Yeah, right? So, and this idea of it's also a public health issue. In South Africa, it was HIV and AIDS. In Brazil, it was Zika. And then now I'm doing my work again in LA. And same thing, if you get arrested for prostitution charges in Los Angeles, they make you submit HIV blood tests.
Immediately.
Yeah, it's not always the case, but kind of the way that we get into talking about the coloniality of these things is that when we look to alleviate anti-trafficking, we do it by giving police more power.
Right.
We award police discretionary power to look and decide, who do I think is selling sex? And when police look and decide, who do I think is selling sex? Usually it's racialized women and it's trans women. Right. So in Los Angeles, one of the anecdotes that has been shared with me from the community group that I work with is, if you are arrested on prostitution charges as a sex worker, it seems that LAPD is more commonly requiring trans women to submit HIV blood tests over cis women. Right? So yeah, it's just it's kind of this big conflation of misrepresentations and misspoken narratives, made up number. Like this 40,000 number virtually appeared out of thin air. Right. And it was taken up by everybody. We're cross-citing, and it's incredibly hard to trace back to kind of where it started. There's a really good book by Gregory Mitchell, who's an academic in the States, and it's called How is it mega sporting events? Or it might be How Global Sporting Events Drive Myths About Sex Trafficking. He has a full chapter on this 40,000 number and just basically how it was produced and taken up by everybody, everywhere, all over the world. But yeah, that's kind of where the work is at now, because this Olympic Games in Los Angeles is supposed to be a no build. So they're not building any new infrastructure. Yeah, for like Olympic venues and stuff. They're using things like the Staples Center, which I think is crypto.com arena now. But
there's a lot to unpack with that one.
yeah. So they're not building, and they're kind of under this assumption that not building is going to cause less harm. But data exists that when these existing infrastructures that they built, even though they're not new to right now, when they were built, they displaced people. Because that's a lot of what critical mega event scholarship looks at, is how do these games displace people from the communities? The Olympics leave or the World Cup leaves, and now these people are left with their homes demolished for mega sport infrastructure. Where do they live?
What is it in Brazil, which is one of the biggest football or soccer, I want to say it, nations in the world? There's so many just empty bird toilets sitting around. Qatar the same. Yeah. So is the Olympics this year or next year?
Sorry, I'm gonna do this quick. There we go. There is a Paris Olympics this year.
Is there one coming to in LA though?
Yeah, in the Los Angeles games are in 2028, which is the second time the city is actually hosted. But like, once again, you want to talk about displacement. Paris literally bussed homeless people. They had school buses that they put homeless people on to displace them from the city.
That's fucked up.
You know what I mean? It's like you're just hiding the problem. We're pulling a rug over it without actually dealing it. And I'll even use the 2016 Brazil Olympics. They didn't fix social infrastructures or problems in Brazil. They literally built walls on the roads to Olympic venues so you couldn't see the poverty behind the walls.
It's fucked up. Yeah, like the fact that Brazil is often a choice for these mega companies to host these huge events, considering that a majority of the country is completely impoverished. Like Rio specifically, Rio is a dangerous town.
You know what, I'm gonna be honest with you, I kind of shy away from that a little bit, of talking about these places as like really dangerous, because I think it lets us make assumptions about the people who live there, and I don't think that is a fair assessment of what goes on. Because you look even here in the city of Toronto, you listen to people talk about Regent Park or Jane and Finch, and we make these assumptions about the people that live there and the lifestyles that people undertake. All of us are human, right? And we conform to the situations that we have. We access economic opportunities where they're available. And in countries, specifically in Latin America and the Global South, oftentimes it's informal economies, like the sale of sex, like the sale of drugs. So are they, I have a little bit of reservation when we start to talk about these places as very dangerous, or framing them, or what's a good word I'm looking for? Like alienating these places, or like making them seem different, and the people there different than the people that are here, because that's not the reality. If I was born, like, I am a university student, I work, and I live what a lot of people would say is a pretty normal and acceptable life. If I was born in a favela in Rio de Janeiro, I probably have
a lot different.
Yeah, and it's has nothing to do with who I am as an individual, but rather the products of my environment, which I think goes back to the structure and agency debate. I typically am always leaning on structure, right? And I think you're absolutely right. Brazil had a decade of mega sporting events, right? They had Pan Am Games, they had the World Cup, and they had the Olympics, all within 10 years of each other. Brazil is a fantastic country, I think, and there's a lot of fantastic people there. However, they have been under what is the least controversial way to say this? American influence, I guess. Like, Latin America as a whole has been a political theater or a trial ground for political ideologies, right? And they have absolutely suffered the consequences of that. Brazil is kind of one of the first places that neoliberalism was really introduced at a structural level. And I think we see the consequences of that in the social, in the political, in the economic landscapes of that country. But yeah, they didn't deal with this. And that's kind of where this coloniality argument talks about whenever we're talking about mega sporting events. Because we're talking about introducing no, that's not the word I'm looking for. I'm going to say modernity into these countries, right? Which I think is adjacent to coloniality. We are essentially creating spaces that mirror the West, that mirror the global North.
Right.
We didn't actually fix the issue of poverty in Brazil, just like we haven't actually fixed the issue of poverty in Toronto.
Yeah.
But if you hang out in the financial district in Toronto, you'd think,
it's a pretty good town.
Everything looks great. If you hung out on the Olympic route in Brazil, you think everything was fantastic there. That's not really the case, though, right? We kind of hide these things. And colonialism, I think now in the modern moment, while it is not we're going to show up and fight wars, we are creating avenues for more subtle, more structural, and more long-term avenues for settlement by financially choking people out of the places that they live. Socially, on the social aspect of that, and kind of where my work comes in with anti-trafficking, is that when we give police this power to incarcerate people on this basis of discretionary power, who do you think is doing what's happening? We create avenues to police and incarcerate based on the deviance of gender and sexuality and promiscuity. So all these ideas around the family or what it means to be a Western male, Western femininity, white masculinity, we're able to reproduce those and solidify them in alternative parts of the world through this initiative of anti-trafficking. We can police gender, we can police sexuality and promiscuity and all these different things, all under this umbrella of anti-trafficking. So we're like socially pacifying the landscape leading up to these games. And that's what's happening right now in LA. We're doing this cleanup. Well, the cleanup is basically we're putting people in jail or arresting people who don't fit into what our ideas of how you should use your body, right?
They're changing the narrative of what, like, they're cleaning up so that they're getting ready for their first date. They're trying to clean up everything to make them seem like there's something that they're not.
Because, and you know what? I think it would even go deeper than that, because it's not even this Olympic appearance, right? It's everybody. We're transferring wealth to private industry in the process, right? Like we're displacing all these people, and I'll speak specifically to the Figueroa corridor. It's not just arresting sex workers, it's also demolishing the hotels and the motels that they work out of. Figueroa Street in LA is a street proposed for in the bid for the LA 2028 Olympics. They have street development infrastructure proposed for Figueroa Street in LA, right? It's not a coincidence that now we have all these development plans. And it's not even just sex work. It's also unhoused people too, living on the street. How are you going to talk about street development and pedestrian infrastructure without even considering the people who call the sidewalks that you want to expand their fucking home?
Yeah.
Right? So we're just looking to displace and put this pretty bow on poverty, when in reality we are doing nothing to structurally address these issues that we have at hand.
And I feel like I already know the answer to this question, but World Cup 2024 is 26 is coming to the States, Mexico, and Canada.
Yeah.
Would you assume, or do you have any insight already into, because for that, knowing being a soccer guy, I know that other than Mexico, probably the States and Canada don't have the soccer stadiums necessary to hold that kind of event yet. So there's going to need to be new infrastructure built. Do you have any insight into where the first ones are going to be popping up?
So they're actually not building for this World Cup. It's
really?
Yeah, so it's all existing infrastructure. I'll speak maybe more to here in Toronto, but they are renovating BMO Stadium.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
To hold more?
Yeah, it's like renovations. And I had this conversation with a colleague very recently, But a lot of the things that we're talking about around mega sporting events right now, we like the Olympics in LA, all those things that I just described about displacement. FIFA kind of fixed its own problem in regards to that.
Really?
Like, yeah, we used to have a lot of these same critiques for FIFA, and like this World Cup is spread out across 3 countries. The next one is spread out as well. I think it's like Argentina, Portugal,
In Spain, I think.
yeah. So the problem is that we concentrate all of this temporary tourism into one area, gentrify the whole place, build all of this new infrastructure, and then we leave.
Yeah.
FIFA kind of alleviated themselves of that problem by spreading it out over all these different countries, which I think for FIFA is quite a good move, honestly. And this is not to paint me as a FIFA lover. They do a lot of other terrible things. But in that regard, compared to the IOC, they're doing a pretty good job at addressing this issue of concentrating these events into cities and rolling over the people who live there in the process. But yeah, I will say about this World Cup, because I kind of sort of was before I started this project in LA, I was looking more so at Mexico City as a 2026 World Cup host city, more so around, because a lot of the things we talked about when we give police powers, we're talking about carceral logics, right? Like how we understand enforcement. Mexico has a very unique issue right now where here in Toronto, we can talk about militarizing the Toronto Police Services. In Mexico, they are actually using their military in police capacity. Like the military is actively going out and performing police duties.
Right. In Mexico, like,
Yeah.
not Mexico City, Mexico.
It is the whole country, yeah. But the Washington Office on Latin America released a report on, I think it's called Human Rights and Militarization of Mexico. But yeah, that's kind of what stemmed that project. But I can tell you, even just from like coursework and stuff and working with different organizations, that human trafficking narrative that we talked about is still coming through. And I think Mexico's geography and ideas that we all have around Mexico are making it a site for Canada and the US and these big humanitarian superpowers to have this like super villain in Mexico, which I don't think is fair of them to do. But yeah, it's like you have to bring into context a larger picture. The US, and I'm not even going to talk about Canada, the US dominates global markets consistently. They're this gatekeeper of power, whether it's financial, whether it's social, political. They hold it. They always hold it. And they hold it over the head of Mexico. So now Mexico becomes a place where the US can exclude them based on the enforcement of borders, procure cheap labor, cheaper manufacturing costs, all while enjoying those exports in their own economy. This produces, I believe, a lot of the realities that we see in Mexico. So as Canada and the US, sorry, man.
You're good.
Start to talk about their, like, it just like, it feels like an arrogance over Mexico almost, right? They not so conveniently exclude the fact that Mexican realities are a product of Western market dominations, right? And I think that's kind of where I was trying to go with that, is that this coloniality element, whether it's settlement or not, and I know Mexico City has some gentrification issues that like locals are kind of organizing against right now, but I think we can talk about the implementation of police and militarized service based on US logics, right? This idea that aggression is the key to safety, and I kind of rebuttal that a little bit. Oh my God, talking too long here.
So you're definitely not on team, like, if there's a drug problem, if there's a criminal problem, quote unquote.
Yeah.
Bringing in more police is not how you solve the problem.
I'm not naive enough to think that there's never situations where you need. Do you edit these?
Yeah, I can bring you water though.
No, it's like my throat is like dry. Anyways, I just want to make sure. All right, I'm going to start again now. I'm not naive enough to think that with the notion of policing or policing reform, which is an entirely another topic, you could probably do another 2-hour conversation on. I feel like aggression is occasionally and very situationally a good reactive response. I do not believe aggression is a suitable disciplinary response.
Right.
I am very pro prison abolition. Right? It is not, aggression is not something that we can employ as this disciplinary measure. Police serve as extensions of the prison system because they procure the people that live in them. And that is where I, at a majority, take issue with policing.
Right. Okay. So we have all these issues. We have all these things going on. If Benton is the king of the world for the day, what's the first thing he does? Like, how do you, in your beliefs and opinions, begin to solve the problem, or at least make steps towards a better tomorrow?
Let's get the cough out of the way before I answer.
Fair enough.
I waited for you to finish those. Yeah, incredible question. Probably more incredibly hard to answer.
Fair.
And you know what? I don't shy away from that sometimes it's hard to answer questions.
Yeah.
I think we can call out systems of injustice and reimagine things as we go, because that's how we produce them. We saw an issue and we collectively as groups work together to form solutions to them. I guess maybe not darting around your question and trying to get an answer out of me. I don't believe prisons are the answer to solving crime problems, drug problems, any issues with informal economies. But yeah, I think mutual aid is probably the answer, and the way that we as communities come together to support each other, right? Whether that is this kind of social policing of the things that we're doing or not. But yeah, I would say that a lot of the responsibilities that police and police departments hold can and should be replaced by mutual aid.
And when you say mutual aid, you mean like bringing in like social workers, support groups, community funding to try to, instead of punishing people for doing a quote unquote bad thing, you bring in people to help them, take them out of a bad place that made them feel that they had to do said thing.
Yeah. When I say mutual aid, what I'm really trying to say is just support people in your community with the best resources that your community has. As I think what I'm trying to get at. And yeah, I think that in so many different aspects replaces a lot of the different roles and responsibilities that police officers currently hold. Right.
And what do you think is holding back Western civilization from taking an approach like that?
Because we love to position aggression as the key to safety. That's the basis of carceral logics, right? It's the notion. I think I'm gonna die. Yeah.
I'll bring you. Do you want some water?
No, I'm good. I just haven't talked for this long in a really long time.
Fair enough.
Yeah, it's like this idea that aggression is the key to safety, and that's the basis of the prison industrial complex. That's the basis of militarizing police forces, that the more aggressive we can make systems, the safer societies we're going to be able to enjoy. I think that is such a flawed logic, right? We don't produce safety by aggression. That's why reincarceration rates are so fucking high.
Yeah, like if you're not solving a problem.
Yeah, if you go to jail once, the chances of you going to jail a second time just skyrocketed.
Really?
Yeah, like this is the basis of incarceration. It's worse in the U.S. because they have like the prison industrial complex. You're familiar, yeah?
Enough.
Yeah, it's basically this notion of prison for profit, right? Like we transferred expertise away from the state to non-state actors and allow them to create these neo-industrial complexes where they're able to provide these aggressive spaces where they're able to procure profit off of it. Like, we have to fill prisons to make money. These prisons are now contributing to your economy, right? It's so problematic.
And these prisons are turning a profit from like taxpayer dollars or from
It's like government money. Yeah. And this is kind of, so in my work and that piece that I published, we talk about the nonprofit industrial complex. So Ruth Wilson Gilmore is the woman who wrote about the nonprofit industrial complex and coined it. But it follows the same logic as the prison industrial complex. Instead of transferring power away from states to prisons, we transfer powers and roles that the state should take on to these humanitarian superpowers, where they are now able to turn profit and deal with human rights issue for profit. Often, they deal with these issues by centering, once again, aggression as a key to safety. Right? Just as prisons look at dealing with drug problems or, I don't know, just generally social deviance problems, and they award policing as the answer, these humanitarian superpowers do the same thing. We're going to fix these problems by policing. And their favorite thing to do is anti-trafficking because it's so profitable. And they, once again, say, we give police more power to go on the street, police these things, break down these alleged human trafficking rings, and look at where it gets us, right? We repeat these narratives and we end up with more violence, this time at the hand of the state and at the whim of these humanitarian superpowers that we had before, right? Because we're trying to generate money. These are for-profit businesses. Even NGOs make money. Nonprofits still make money.
They got to pay their employees somehow.
Yeah, it makes so much money, and people like to forget that. And I think sort of blindly take up the initiatives of a lot of these groups. When in reality, if you dig a little deeper, I think you'll see that there's something a little bit more substantial going on that I think requires a good deal of inspection, and that's kind of where I find my own work.
So if all these companies that are trying to paint this narrative and make better are essentially, at the end of the day, just like any other business trying to turn a profit, and then you transition that into what you were saying with mutual aid and using a community's best resources to help the community, don't you think that at some point someone along the line is going to say we can now profit off of this too?
I think if you buy into ideas that competition and growth are the best ways to run your economy, like obviously if you center competition in an economy and somebody sees something that there lacks competition, it's open for the taking, people are going to take it, right? But that is personally not my economic stance and not things that I advocate for. And I think it's important to mention that when we're talking about these things, we are like human trafficking, like dealing with that issue of these like anti-human trafficking narratives, it's not going to fix the whole problem.
Right.
Well, there are economics of problems. This, like, we need to talk about prison abolition at the same time. We need to talk about open borders and status for all at the same time, kind of like what we talked about with New Zealand. There are larger issues that summate into these problems. And to think that one is going to solve the issue, I think is a very naive approach to these problems, right? There's a summation of intersecting social factors that produce these issues. Hence, it's going to take a summation of different social resistance to alleviate them.
Right. As for the borders thing, do you realistically think that the states would ever even consider doing that?
Why not?
Well, here's the thing. I mean, like, listen, like, even if we take out the fucking build a wall motherfuckers, considering some people were like, an imaginary line isn't enough. I want a physical wall. Even if you take that factor out, it's as evident as every time I have to go through TSA. Like, the amount of hours I've spent standing in a damn line to make sure they didn't bring fucking meat over the border coming back from somewhere, let alone giving free reign to people.
Yeah.
And again, they paint that on the grounds of terrorism and everything.
Yeah.
But do you realistically think that is something that would ever actually be considered?
I like to hope it is. And I am kind of glad you brought this up, because I think, and I always offer this to people, is that when we think about borders and what it means to go through the border, or like individual experiences of going through borders, I think it's very easy to find what I keep repeating tirelessly, this idea that aggression is the key to safety, right? Like, think about the way that TSA is even structured, right? It's very aggressive, and
everyone's fucking mean there.
Yeah, exactly. And there's this idea that it's supposed to keep us safe. People are like, well, how can you have like open migration and status for all? That doesn't make sense. You have all these like different governments, to which I offer, we already practice open migration. Like, you just moved from Vaughan, right?
Yeah.
You crossed borders, political boundaries, and you did so without having to go through something like TSA. You crossed borders. I can move to Vancouver and just file paperwork to say that I live in Vancouver now. I would cross hundreds or thousands of municipal borders, let alone provincial borders, to get there.
Yep.
We practice open migration domestically. That can be a global model, should we so choose. But by having these very aggressive national borders, we're able to concentrate and control who gets to enjoy what is in that country. Like, I guess in like TikTok terms, you're gatekeeping it a little bit, right?
Yeah.
And
when you think about it that way, like, you can't go from Spain to Portugal without a passport.
Yeah.
But I can go from Ontario to Vancouver,
Yeah.
technically without one.
And it's
that's a whole lot more land and a
Yeah.
lot further, and God knows what I could have got up with it on the way.
Yeah, and it's like the European Union already does this. We already have models for it. It exists. Not perfect. Certainly there's things I would change, but yeah, like it already exists. And a lot of us have practiced it. We've moved and we've crossed borders, and you don't need a passport. You just show up, fill out the paperwork, and you have status, right? But we see so much violence along these border states, which another reason why I think LA is so interesting, just based on its proximity to the Mexican border and the kind of border debates that are going on right now in the U.S. It's such a complex summation of issues in LA that is like mega sports, borders, anti-trafficking, everything is going on there right now, and it is quite captivating, to be honest.
But everyone knows LA as Hollywood,
City of Angels. City of Angels.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, no, but I would say LA has more devils than angels, maybe, but yeah.
Yeah, well, most of the angels are devils in disguise. So
Yeah,
not to mention.
probably. Yeah.
Well, sir, you have humbled me more than once today. You have given me a few outlooks to reconsider, and honestly, especially, and it would this time spent talking about Brazil more so than anything gave me almost embarrassed me a little bit that I don't want to say that I was naive enough to call it dangerous, but like didn't care enough about what I was saying to really think about, well, why do I consider it that way? But I really appreciate your time and your outlook and everything. This has probably been the most successful and what I want this podcast to be thing. So I appreciate you, and I appreciate you coming on, spending your day to do so. Yeah, it was awesome. I really appreciate it, man.
Yeah, man, no worries. It's a learning process for all of us. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's I think I'm very fortunate to spend a lot of time with these ideas, but for all of us, there's going to be new information all the time, right? And I don't think we should be hesitant to change the way we think, because a better world comes from being comfortable on learning what we think we know and what we think it is, right? So yeah, shouldn't be humbling, but I don't know. a learning curve that every single one of us goes through, right? So
Oh, trust me, I'm humbling in the best way possible.
there we go.
I learned a lot today, and I appreciate it.
Of course, I'm glad to be here.
Well, thank you very much, guys, for listening. Thank you, Benton, for coming on. As always, there's going to be links to anything Benton would want me to link to. If there's any questions you have for myself, Benton, if you want to hear him come on again and talk more about this kind of stuff, let me know. Otherwise, anything you want to leave off on?
I think that's it for me, my friend.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much, guys, for listening to the Devil Therapist podcast. And as always, peace and love, everyone. Have a great night.